Our trip on the road to Draft Day 2024 continues with another positional deep dive, this time looking at the defenders. Welcome back to the Draft FC podcast, the podcast website and YouTube channel dedicated to all things official draft FPL. My name's Mitch and I'm your host for the second episode in our Road to Draft Day 2024 series, going through each of the positions. We've already done the goalkeepers, so go and check that video out if you haven't seen it already. And today we will be talking about the defenders. Now, if you're brand new to the channel, please subscribe. If you're an FPL draft player, you're going to want to see what we've got coming up over the next days and weeks, and you're also going to want to stick with us for the season as a whole to give you some hints and tips along the way to steer you towards victory come the end of the season. And as I said in my intro, we do also have a website which you can find at draftfc.co.uk, where we have a whole host of tools for official draft FPL managers to help gear you up for success in your draft leagues, both now in the summer as you're preparing for your draft days and every week of the season as it goes on. So for now, the most important thing that you're going to be interested in are draft rankings, which we have in the site already. I'm tweaking those every day, but I'm fairly happy with how it's shaping up at the moment. In that table, you'll also have unique access to our sort of distillation of all the drafts that are happening globally every single day. That's updated. I think it's updated at midnight every day UK time, so that you get a fresh wave of data coming in, and that averages out where all the managers in the world are taking those players. So as well as our rankings, we also put the official FPL rankings in there just for the sake of it. You'll also have those average draft picks from around the world. Combining that with your own biases, your own data, your own rankings that you might have put together, you should be pretty well set for draft day. You can also have our draft room open alongside the official FPL tab when you're doing your draft, and it will auto-populate your draft table live during the draft, so you can see who's going to each manager, see who's free right at the top of the list, and it works really seamlessly. So check that out, and if you want access to that, go and buy a pre-season pack, which will give you instant access to all of that and give you access to the site for a month. Now, the last episode on goalkeepers was quite a long one. I'm expecting this one could drag on a little long too. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. So this episode will follow a similar structure to the one you'd have seen with the goalkeepers. Have a little look back, little look forwards, and then some more detailed stuff, going through a few picks individually. And also some good fixture rotations to think about for picking up defenders in the later rounds. So, looking back to a year ago, some of the main two defenders that I was highlighting in pre-season last year were not really controversial at the time. It was Alexander-Arnold, who I had inside round 2, and Kieran Trippier, who I had just inside round 3. The rest of the defenders were falling somewhere below this, with the Liverpool guys, John Stones, who I was pretty high on last summer, and then the Arsenal centre-backs, rounding off my top-tier defenders. Pedro Porro was someone I had higher than most, which was a good call. Bad call, however, was putting Ben White way down the list behind the likes of Konate and Estupiñán. White was someone that was more popular than I probably credited him for at the time, with an average draft pick inside the 5th round. My main concern was the arrival of Jurrien Timber, who came in as a centre-back that could do a job at right-back too, not too dissimilar to White. So somewhat of a surprise, to me at least, to see him slotting in at left-back ahead of Zinchenko, but obviously we know, sadly, how his season panned out. But it meant White became a near ever-present 35 league starts last season, 9 attacking returns, 18 clean sheets along the way. Yeah, a real juggernaut of a season, considering how poorly a lot of the other defenders performed. Overall, the mood around defenders was colder than it has been for a few years. This is ahead of last season. Alexander-Arnold had a dip, and say Trippier, who led the way with 198 FPL points, was really the main highlight defender from the season before that one. But it seemed, and it probably does still seem, that long gone are the days where we could have a clutch of defenders breaking the 200-point mark. So if we actually review last season as it was, without having to go into really any detail, specific examples or numbers, it's not controversial to state that from the off, the defenders were disappointing last season. The regular Arsenal trio of White, Saliba and Gabriel were the only ones that could be relied on for consistent returns. And that was purely down to the number of clean sheets that Arsenal were keeping. They managed 18 for the season. But really, where were the rest of the clean sheets for everybody else? Only 2 defenders managed to break the 150-point mark, which were Ben White and Saliba. Gabriel was close on 149. And only 21 defenders in the game managed to get more than 4 points per start, which is generally a good baseline, a good benchmark that I use for a useful defender in an average, moderately sized draft league. Now, I listen to a lot of football content. I listen to a lot of stuff on data analysis, on individual clubs, a lot of FPL stuff. It may be that I've just missed it, but one of the things I haven't heard a lot of chat about this year, not directly at least, is that the Premier League, to me, seemed to fundamentally change last year. Now, the reasons why don't really matter too much for us in terms of looking at draft and looking at FPL, other than we simply have to adjust our projections and our assumptions on that. But if I had to speculate what was different last year, I think it's a combination of things. It's always going to be a combination of things. I think the bigger clubs, and that group who you could call bigger clubs, is now 8 or 9 strong, could be even getting towards half the league now, I think have pulled away further from those in the bottom half of the table. I think it's really hard now for the newly promoted clubs to get anywhere near that. We had new injury time rules, extending games longer than ever before. By extension, the average time the ball was in play last season was just under 59 minutes, which is around 4 minutes longer than the previous season. But so what, though? A few extra minutes here and there. The final league table still ended up looking, like something we'd expect to see, at the beginning of the season. I think the key is the number of goals being scored. And I think particularly the number of goals being scored with that extra time being added on. So in the 22-23 season, so that's the one before last, we saw the highest goal tally for over a decade. There were 1,084 goals scored in the Premier League as a whole for the season. So that's all the clubs' goals added up. 1,084. Last season, we saw 1,246 goals across the season, a 15% increase, and the highest we've seen in the Premier League era. You'd have to go back to the early 60s to find similar goal scoring rates in the top division, and obviously the nature of the game was unrecognisable to what we would be used to watching today. Those watching on the YouTube channel, you'll be able to see a graph that I've got up, and I'll link this graph in the descriptor notes for those listening on the audio, because I think that really this picture tells the story in itself. And here I'm plotting those numbers that I've just mentioned. So I've gone back 10 years to the 14-15 season to how many goals were scored across the whole season. So we've got 975. After that, pretty steady, just over 1,000 goals a season in every season. You could pretty much throw a hat over those numbers. And then the orange bar for last year just shows how much of a step up that is. Now, again, not to patronise you, but obviously more goals really equals less clean sheets, a lot less clean sheets. The total number of clean sheets over the Premier League season has been, again, similar to the goals scored, has been remarkably consistent over the past decade. Average number, if you were to add up all the clean sheets that every team gets, is around 215, and it's really consistent around that number. Within this, if you were to break it down, we've seen, on average, half the clubs in the league would end up with 10 or more clean sheets. In the 2021 and the 14-15 seasons, going back a bit further, even 14 clubs managed to individually get 10 or more clean sheets over the course of the season. So the average was 215, as I just said. Last season, the total number of clean sheets we saw was just 157 around the league. That's a 27% reduction compared to that average. Only 7 teams managed to get 10 or more clean sheets. That's the lowest in the Premier League era. Generally, the poorest defences in the league, so those guys battling relegation, would tend to get around 5 or 6 clean sheets in a season. That varies a little bit, but around that number. Last season, all 3 of the bottom clubs combined managed just 5 clean sheets between them, with Sheffield United themselves only managing 1 clean sheet in the entire 38-game season. And again, for those watching, I've got a graph showing that data. So for those listening, again, I'll link that in the description below. The blue bars are showing you all the clean sheets across the same time frame as the previous graph, averaging around 215. That orange bar was last season. Massive drop-off. The other interesting stat to highlight which I've also superimposed on this graph, which is the orange line at the bottom there, is the number of goals that were scored in injury time, in second half injury time. So goals scored after 90 minutes. Now, this number across the years does fluctuate a bit. Tends to fluctuate between 50 and 70 goals over the season scored after the 90-minute mark. Last season, there were 100 goals scored post 90 minutes. So that's what that little line is showing. So we're kind of grumbling along, and then bang, a massive uptick, which fits in with what you can kind of remember. There were loads of games that had multiple goals scored even in injury time. And obviously, the more goals that are being scored, as I've said, the less clean sheets there will be. Now, just to be clear, this isn't me moaning about the new rules or suggesting that we shouldn't be seeing more injury time, given the lurch towards, that we've seen towards tactical injuries and time wasting and, over the last few years. It's just an indication that really the status quo has changed. Now, you could look at these numbers and just sort of say, well, it's an anomaly. We'll see a return to the norm again this year. But we're not watching the same sport, really, given the rule changes. We've got VAR getting tweaked every year. We've got the refereeing directives, which obviously have had a massive impact on the time added on. The Premier League and the powers that be want more goals. So these metrics will only please them. More goals means more casual watchers are interested. It means more people wanting to buy subscriptions to Sky and TNT Sports. It just means more money coming in. More goals is more money for them. Now, in 2024, it doesn't really matter what sport you play. It isn't a good time to play defence or to be on the opposing side of the scoring. More goals in football, more restrictions on defenders in NFL because they want more attacking plays. Shorter boundaries in cricket means you don't want to be a bowler. It's all geared towards helping the batsman out. 21st century fans apparently just want to see more goals, more points, more runs, and it doesn't matter how. So let's look ahead to the upcoming season. Now, many of you, no doubt, will be looking at players, as I do, as we all should be doing, over multiple seasons. So you'll rightly point out Mo Salah's got absolutely terrifying consistency, in the 200 club that goes over many years. And as such, we can continue to draft him highly. Now, due to those changes in the way that football was really played last year, I don't think we can carry on doing that with defenders in the way that we have done. And I think we need to put far more emphasis on looking at how defenders performed just last year rather than extending that eye back to 2 or 3 years. Because, as I said, the landscape, particularly with clean sheets, has completely changed. You factor in the bonus point changes, which I already mentioned with the keepers, which penalises them for not keeping clean sheets, and it doesn't look good for the majority of defensive assets out there. Even getting a goal return in a 2-1 win can mean they're going to struggle to pick up bonus points. Given the lack of clean sheets going around, we're going to have to pay far more attention to the defenders that can attack. Now, this is hardly novel advice, but I think on draft day, when you're looking at your second or third defender, our eyes need to be drawn towards the defender with some attacking upside versus a defender that we might have previously relied on to pull in a steady stream of clean sheets. Now, if we look at the data from last season, again, these aren't going to massively surprise you. I plotted FPL points versus a few metrics to look at where the strong associations were. Interestingly, for defenders, the biggest correlation with performance was not clean sheets. It was very close behind, but the top correlation with performance was attacking returns. And that's probably just a sign of the poor clean sheets market last year. Now, the correlation coefficient for that was 0.82. For clean sheets, it was 0.81, so it was pretty much just as good an indication of performance. And in terms of negatively impacting that, goals conceded was also very high up there. Less goals conceded, more points for defenders. Again, it's not rocket science. I think the important thing for the upcoming season and draft days across the world is where some of the premium defenders appear on the board. And are there even premium defenders anymore? Does that label still exist? I think for most managers in most leagues, it's going to be realistic that you don't end up with a defender in your squad in the opening 4 or 5 rounds. And that shouldn't panic you. I think that's something to have in the back of your mind. If you find yourself on draft day, round 5's just gone and you've just picked up another forward and you're looking at your squad and you've got 3 forwards, 2 mids, or 3 mids and 2 forwards, I think that's fine. I think that's absolutely fine, and it's probably going to set you up very, very well. there's just not enough to differentiate the great defenders from the good ones. And most weeks you're going to be looking to optimise your lineup, I expect, with a setup that includes 3 at the back. So that's going to be 3-4-3 or 3-5-2. 3-5-2 is probably going to be more likely for most, given the lack and the stranglehold in the forward market. So for the vast majority of us, for most of the season, we're going to be setting up 3-5-2, which means there's always going to near enough be 1 or 2 defenders on your bench. I think the little golden age of defenders being able to, reliably be called upon to put up 6-pointers for your team are gone and are unlikely to come back anytime soon. The only thing that could shift this slightly more back towards the mean, if you think back to those graphs that I just showed in terms of goals scored and clean sheets, is management being aware of those numbers and realising that if they can work out a system that manages to keep more clean sheets, they're going to do very, very well in the Premier League, because that's going to set them pretty much ahead above the rest. So that's something we do need to consider, whether we see tactically what you might perceive something a bit more negative to come through in more teams than we're used to. But let's have a look at some individual player rankings, because really that's all you're all here for. And a lot of you have probably just skipped to this point anyway. If you have done that, I would urge you to rewind to the bit on goals scored and clean sheets, the bit where you can see the graphs up on the screen, because I think that stuff is very relevant and very interesting. But let's start with the main man, Trent AlexanderArnold. Now, I think if premium defenders remain, then AlexanderArnold is still at the top of the list. Now, he may be the only one that occupies that niche. From a purely footballing perspective, there isn't really another player with his ability playing as a defender in the league. His delivery from both open play and set pieces, his power, the position he finds himself in are all amazing for a defender in FPL. Now, the way Arnie's slot will set up isn't really fully confirmed yet. They've only had one public pre-season game the other day, and there were a lot of first-teamers that were missing for that. But given the way he's managed previous squads, there's a strong chance that we see Trent inverting up into midfield and virtually playing as a midfielder for Liverpool while they're in possession. Last season, he was obviously hampered by injuries. Still managed 7 attacking returns from the equivalent of about 24 full 90-minute matches. He's had seasons where he's almost got to an attacking return in 50% of appearances. But I think for this season, expecting a goal involvement somewhere just north of 1 in 3 is both fair and also would firmly cement him as the number 1 defender. Now, being the top defender doesn't necessarily tell us where he goes in the draft. Now, at the time of recording this, I have him slotted in at around 21st overall. So, depending on the size of your league, somewhere late in the 3rd round, possibly creeping into the 4th round. His official FPL rank based on price is 29th, which, you know what, I don't think is probably too far off the mark either. And his global average pick position currently, at the time of recording this, sits around 19th, which is, to me, a little high. But, I think all of these numbers are kind of figuring out roughly where he is. If you were to average those out, it puts him around 25th overall, which sounds about right. I've got a really fun segment in the next video when I'm looking at the midfielders, where I go through the opening few rounds of a mock draft and I highlight in there, I don't actually name the players, I just put them by position, but I think there is a real potential headache that comes with taking Trent in the 3rd round, depending on the makeup of your squad at that point, that you'll see when I go through in that video. But stay tuned for that, because I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you. I also had a look at his non-penalty expected goal involvements per 90. And over the last 3 years, incredibly, averages 0.46, which is phenomenal. If you get that from a decent midfielder or striker, you're fairly happy with that. Now, the next player on the list is Vardiol for Manchester City, an incredible run of form at the end of the campaign with huge head-to-head smashing scores. Now, I just returned from a holiday in Croatia, and one of the final things I saw as I was in the taxi heading to the airport was a huge billboard for Ojusko beer, which is kind of the main beer that you get out there, with Vardiol stood there, smiling away, holding a pint, which I thought, I have to take that as a sign. I was already quite high on him, but yeah, that was just a nice little message from the Croatian gods that we need to value him appropriately this season. At the time of recording this, I've got him sitting around 37th overall. I think if you manage to get him as your number 1 defender, you can be fairly pleased with yourself. I think he'll continue to start the majority of games for City. I'm expecting City's clean sheet potential to nudge up slightly. If any team can do it, I think City can. And he was getting plenty of shots away, averaging more than a shot a game, which for a defender is pretty good going. Next is Ian Matson for Aston Villa. Was at Chelsea, went on loan to Dortmund, now permanent move to Villa, which I think is a really, really good move for him. He's a player I've had a real good feeling about this summer. He's basically a left-back come winger who could be meeting the perfect tactical setup to show off his abilities. We've known since Emery's time at Villa that left-back spot has been a really productive position, whether that's been Digne or Alex Moreno, whoever has featured there. And it's fallen to that side to have more width coming from the back, with the right side usually Concert sitting slightly deeper to leave them in the back three when they're in possession. Now, I'm fairly certain one of the current Villa left-backs will leave, and I don't want you to have any doubt that Matson will be first choice. He got into the Champions League team of the season last year with his time at Dortmund. The numbers aren't amazing. I think a lot of this is a lot more eye test and a feel for how he could slot in that system. But I think he could be a really good mid-draft day bargain. Currently sitting around 75th in my ranks, but don't be surprised if he ends up nudging slightly higher as the summer goes on. Then the final player to highlight is Jan van Hekke for Brighton. Now, he's interesting to me mainly for the potential tactical role he could have in the Huertler system, which is that assuming they continue to play in the way that he has done, which has landed in the job. Previously, the middle centre-back, so he would set up in the back three, and when they've got the ball, particularly as they're passing out from the back, the middle centre-back of the three would pretty much just go and become a CDM and step up into midfield. Now, a lot of people initially, because Dunk is normally the one that would play centrally in the back three, were talking about Dunk being that guy. But I can't think of anyone less suited to receiving the ball centrally like that than Dunk. Dunk needs to be there at the back, seeing everything in front of him. Van Hekke, to me, is just too obvious a candidate to do that role if they're going to do it, because he's played centre mid before for Brighton. Now, it doesn't mean he's going to suddenly become a playmaker, but his position could be a lot more advanced than we're used to, and therefore an interesting punt early on in the season. Early Brighton fixtures are okay, but if you went in this direction, you're going to probably want to pair him off with a decent rotation player, such as a Forest defender, as the fixtures dovetail quite nicely, which I will get onto in just a moment. So let's talk about some of those fixture rotations. So the process is quite straightforward. If you haven't come across this idea already, you pick a couple of defenders for cheap late in the draft whose fixtures nicely dovetail for a few weeks, meaning that you play one, bench one, and you can switch them as their good and bad fixtures come around. I think this tactic is stronger in the current climate. As I said already, most will be playing a formation with a back three, which means we'll all be benching at least one defender most weeks, so you're not going to have a headache of not being able to bench one of them. Now, I think special mention has to go to Nottingham Forest, because their opening three fixtures, Bournemouth at home, Southampton away, Wolves at home, are as good as they get on the board. So if you end up in a panic late in the draft, not a bad move to grab one of their likely starters. And their likely starters being Murillo, Bolly, Nico Williams, and slightly less clear on the first choice left back between Aina and Toffolo, but we'll see how pre-season pans out. Forest also stand out, as you'll see from the table, in that they have a number of teams that complement their fixtures, which obviously opens up a range of possible pickups in the later rounds, which is always helpful. Now, for those watching on the YouTube channel, you'll be able to see that I've just put together a very simple defender rotation cheat sheet table. Now, again, for those listening, I'll try and crop that and link it as an image link below. And what this table is very simply showing is each team on the left, and then my preferred counterpart rotating team with the good complementary fixtures. So column 1 is my first choice pairing, 2 is second best, and so on. So, I'm not going to subject you to reading out reams of fixtures. I'm not going to go through how every rotation actually shapes up, because that will just be so boring, and we'll be here for another 10 minutes just listing off fixtures. I can trust you all to go and have a look at them yourselves. Hopefully this table can be a nice part of your draft day backup notes for those later rounds where it can start to become a bit messy, you're a bit tired, you have no idea who's left, who you've even got on your team, and you can quickly glance down and go, right, I've got so-and-so, therefore I can pick up a player from that defence. Now, you'll notice there are only 7 teams listed on there. The teams that aren't included in this list either don't appeal or simply don't rotate well with other clubs, which is generally because they've got a bad run of opening fixtures. Now, some of these teams have kind of marquee defensive assets that you might have already picked up in the middle rounds. So this table, again, can quickly point you to a corresponding team to pick up another defender in what I like to call the twilight rounds. Just to lay the point, let's say I pick up Shah for Newcastle in round 7. I'm now in round 13 and I've still got a couple of defensive slots to fill. This table, I can quickly look Newcastle. First choice pairings, Nottingham Forest. So I go and look, click on Nottingham Forest. I can see that Bolly is free, so I select him. Easy peasy. If none of the Nottingham Forest defenders were available, I would go back to my table and say, right, who's the next best fit? The next best team is Everton, and I would go and pick up one of their defenders if free, and so on. I guess the other thing to quickly run through is who I see as the safe picks in those defences. Now, they're not all certain, but I'll cover those. So for Villa, I would expect the back four to be Konsa, Pau Torres, Diego Carlos and Matson as it stands. For Brighton, Van Hecke, Dunk, Veltman. Then less clear over the fullbacks. You've got Estupinan there. Barso's been doing very well. Lamptey's there. Igor's there. So hopefully pre-season will give us a better idea. For Palace, I think it will carry on as we left it last year, dependent on no outgoings. So that'll be Munoz and Mitchell at wing-backs, and then Anderson, Gay and Richards in the back three. Again, for Everton, barring any departures, it should be pretty much as it was last season. Tarkowski, Brathwaite and Mikolenko are the main guys you're going to want. Fulham again, I don't see major changes. It'll be Castagna and Robertson at full-back, Diop and Bassi at centre-back. Newcastle is probably the more complicated one of these teams. Shah is the most nailed. I think Byrne is fairly nailed to step in at centre-back because Botman is injured for a few months, as is Jamal Lascelles. If Trippier is still there, I would expect Trippier to play. If he's not, then Livramento becomes an absolute shoo-in. The main question mark would be how the left-back spot gets filled. Could be Lewis Hall, could be Kelly, but hopefully we'll have more info as a bit more of pre-season gets played. And then for Nottingham Forest, I've already covered them just a minute ago. A small note to include is that this table could be used for midfielders. So, for example, if I picked up Leon Bailey in one of the middle rounds, a later pickup of Iwobi could work quite nicely. I would say it doesn't work in quite the same way because, as I said, we are likely going to be benching one or two defenders every week, and a lot of us are going to end up with a forward that's not exactly starting material. So the way this rotation works is that you're banking on being able to bench one of the players in the rotation. And I think there's going to be a lot of game weeks for most of us where we're playing 5 mids. And then obviously it doesn't work because they're playing every game. So that's it for the second episode of the Draft FC Road to Draft Day 2024 series, covering some of the chat around defenders. I hope you found that useful. If there was anything else you want to add, any questions, feel free to comment them below if you're watching on YouTube. For anyone else, you can always DM me. The best place is on X, formerly Twitter. Give us a follow on there at draft_FC, and I'm always responsive to the DMs. Some of you will also be aware of me on Reddit. I'm not quite so responsive to those because I don't check. And we do also have an Instagram page, which I'll start updating a bit more as the season gets going. And yeah, I'll check those now and again too. But X is the easiest way to get hold of me. And you can message me about anything to do with draft, our content, the site, football. Always happy to chat. If you think some of the stuff we've got going on at draftfc.co.uk is going to be helpful for you, if you want to have a peek at our rankings and those average draft tables, then head over to there and sign up. If you caught the beginning of the last video, you'll know if you're an existing member, our Refer a Friend feature just got a bit of an upgrade. So if you are a member and refer a friend that signs up, you'll get £5 credit into your account, and the friend that you refer will get 50% off. Also, if you are a member on a standard monthly plan and want the pre-season access, you can do that with a slightly cheaper rate as well using the discount code MEMBERDRAFTROOM, which I'll put on screen now. Again, I'll put that in the last video too, and that will make the pre-season pack a bit cheaper for you. But yeah, subscribe on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, comment, follow on whichever podcast platform you're listening on if you're listening to the audio. Leaving reviews is really nice and helpful, particularly if you like what we do but can't stretch to being a paid up member on the site. Leaving us a review is just as valuable to us, and it is a nice way of showing your appreciation. And again, it helps us get the stuff out there more. And as I said last time, the more eyes and ears that we reach, the more popular this gets, the more resources we're able to put back into it. The bigger it grows, the better it gets for everyone else. So any and all support is much appreciated. Now, obviously, the next video, we will be getting into the attackers. I'll be looking at the midfielders. As I've mentioned earlier on in the video, I've got a really cool slide that I'm going to go through in there where I kind of go through the opening rounds of a mock draft, which I think will be really useful to go through. It's also another reason why just doing the odd mock draft, even though a lot of people will tell you they're useless, can really just frame how you see the draft board looking after a few rounds so that you don't get caught out for the main event. But I'll leave you to it for now. Say, make sure you subscribe and following so you don't miss out on that episode when it comes out, which will likely be within the next 48 hours. And until then, as always, stay shook.